Rafael, can you elaborate a bit why is trust so important for team effectiveness?
Many studies over the years have shown that teamwork and trust are sort of inextricably linked. And in fact, as a result, it's not a surprise to find that trust as a moderator of team performance appears in many of the key teamwork models that we're used to using in order to support the design of training programs. Perhaps more importantly, if you look at team performance in the round, you can think of both task work and teamwork pathways that both integrate over time to support successful outcomes. And we know that building trusting relationships within any type of team is critical for that integration of those two skill pathways and ultimately the way that teams successfully perform. Researchers have spent many years looking across the team research base, and those sort of meta-analytic studies, sometimes involving thousands of teams, have universally shown that trust is a key part of team effectiveness, and that's even the case when we take into account differences in the leadership style that teams have, or even the team history. And as a result, what we can say is that we understand very well what good trust behavior and what poor trust behavior looks like. Now, that's very important for the design of training programs. It means that we can look out for trust promoting behaviors. We can build it into training imperatives, whether it's the creation of effective sort of communication forums, whether it's developing ways of sharing information, creating a positive team climate, and also critically ensuring that teams use learning experiences so that they reflect back on both positive and less successful trust experiences. And certainly when we look at poor performing teams, you'll see almost the exact opposite. Very low levels of communication, limited amounts of empathy for colleagues, and often you'll see some breakdowns in sort of shared situation and communication. And those things become even more exacerbated when we start to consider sort of virtual and hybrid ad hoc teams. So moving away from those traditional, stable, co-located teams that we used to see in the past. And they will have even more challenges. And I think that's where some of the technology, particularly the sorts of things that Karen is looking at the moment, may have a part to play.
Yeah, what I found quite interesting is, and it came through your piece also in the report, is that how many times success and failure is the result of trust or lack thereof, and it's not a technical issue or something else that we might consider being the reason for a result not being positive. And you only realize this at the end when you kind of reflect upon the behaviors, and typically in a moment of crisis you hope that trust is there for the teams to do the right thing. But you bring, of course, the other aspect, and maybe other panelists have some thoughts as well, that increasingly we work in an environment, we work in more than one teams, and you don't have the luxury of time to build trust over time, and therefore you need some other tools to help you build the trust in a team that might be ad hoc, short-lived, changing all the time. Would welcome any thoughts you and others might have on that.
Well, I mean, if I could start, I'm sure that the technologies here will have their own thoughts. But it is an interesting point you make in the sense that, as I say, we're very much used to, and I can certainly think of the teams I looked at in the past. We're very much used to dealing with those sort of teams who have a chance to develop and mature over time. You can think of different team development models, sort of storming, norming, performance type models, or similar. But what effectively that means is that those teams can orientate to each other and to the task. And so you have an opportunity as a team to test your trust boundaries and your trust behaviors. And these are things that you can rehearse when you're in a training setting, whether that's part of a sort of a formal training program or not. However, with a team that's brought together very quickly, it could be an agile military team, or it could be a procurement team that's brought together to design a new platform, a new defence sort of platform, and you're looking to pull in expertise across industry, and maybe even across sort of national boundaries. They don't have the same level of familiarity, so trying to ensure that they're developing sort of deep shared mental models is ultimately not likely to succeed. So you therefore need to start thinking about alternative team training approaches. Now, some of those could be around concepts such as swift trust, developed by Myerson and other colleagues. And now that really effectively says, maybe actually what we need to be doing is just thinking about developing just enough trust. So this will be different for different teams, and according to the training needs analysis that's sort of undertaken. But effectively, you're trying to sort of say, okay, in the first instance, if you can demonstrate technical competency, if you can have some early information exchanges, if you can demonstrate integrity in your initial decision making, that is enough just to get that initial trust, and that may be sufficient to enable the team as an ad hoc team or a hybrid team or even in a virtual setting to be able to perform effectively. And then if there's time, then you through social proof, benevolence and inclusion, those sorts of things, those sort of behavior, a team is then able to develop deeper trust. But we definitely need to think from a team training perspective in a different way when thinking about those hybrid and ad hoc teams.
Alan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it just expand on that, certainly because I certainly can't talk from the scientific perspective, but certainly from a personal perspective, sort of from operations and sort of harking back to Afghanistan and Apache, we'd be doing quite a lot of our work working with joint tactical air controllers on the ground, often from a different nation. And it was absolutely imperative because we needed to get ordnance or effect in a particular place at a particular time in order to save lives, and it needed to be done quickly. So the trust that was required between the crew and the guy on the ground who is in need of rapid assistance was absolute. Now, we recognized, of course, that both crews have a churn rate because the squadrons change over and crews change over. As did the JTACs. They finish their tours and go over. But we recognised that trust was so important that before they deployed, before they come into Camp Bastion, before they deployed out into the Bondu, so to speak, that we would physically develop that personal, interpersonal link. So you could almost look somebody in the eye and you could talk through the sorts of procedures that your previous experiences. You could talk through the previous engagements that you've been through that they would probably know about anecdotally, and you probably what you're trying to do, or what we were trying to do, was build up that library of shared experiences that helped build up the trust between the two of us, so that therefore knowing and understanding that both the guy on the ground and the guy in the air know exactly what they're doing, they know exactly how to operate their equipment. And a bit like going back to the famous quote from the Apollo 13 movie, don't tell me what it's designed to do, tell me what it can do. But you could improvise, adapt and overcome, and adapt to varying situations quite quickly, knowing that you could get the maximum effect out of the machine that you were operating. And that helped build trust. We found that when that wasn't possible, then actually those if you like, those exchanges, those initial exchanges between us and the guy on the ground just took that a little bit longer because there wasn't that trust there. So for us, it was imperative, and it was always front and center of what we did.
Yeah. The other thing that came to my mind as I was reflecting about what you both said, and again, from personal experience rather than based on scientific research, that when the team dynamic is positive, when there is a certain level of openness and transparency in sharing information. And I think that's where, and obviously I'm talking in the context of military and defense, where we know that often security requirements restrict that. But it's human nature, when you open up, when you show some vulnerability, the other side is more likely to trust you because you shared a piece of information. And this is where I think the leader in teams is quite important in terms of setting the tone, and how the team members ought to interact. You know, and I would think, in particular in the military domain, in a multicultural setting, where you have, you know, multinational teams working together, you know, how much information you share, what you don't share, and how you build trust, because you really depend on each other. But yet again, you belong obviously to different national contingencies as well. I think it's a fascinating aspect.
Yeah, I was just going to add, actually, Christine, I think you're absolutely right. There are an awful lot of things that we can do by focusing on the leader of teams, particularly when they're in less stable team structures. And we know that if we encourage team leaders to really seek to promote trust at almost every opportunity, to create that open, transparent environment, and also that if we enable team leaders to understand what are the indicators or cues of potential dysfunctional performance in sort of remote settings, that this will support them. And in fact, in the past, we've developed guides for the Maritime Warfare Centre, which have looked at exactly this sort of approach, because if you don't necessarily know what to look out for, it's actually quite hard for a leader of a sort of a remote team to understand if perhaps the process of teamwork within those remote sub-teams is actually starting to deteriorate. So you're absolutely right. The team leader plays a very important part in keeping the glue, if you like, gluing that sort of collaborative performance. And as trainers, we can do an awful lot to support them in that.
Right. So let me now move then to the machines. Let's bring the machines into the picture. And it was interesting at the beginning, Raphael, you talked about the cognitive and affective aspects of trust. And I'm looking at a machine, and I'm looking at you, Karen. How do I translate, transfer, adapt the concept of trust to a human-machine interaction where some of those affective elements are not naturally there to build trust?
Yeah, okay, that's actually quite interesting. And listening to Raf just now, it's interesting all the different facets and the richness of trust between teams, human teams and individuals. And I think in a human machine context, it's actually not quite so complicated, interestingly enough. Because in fact, if you're looking at technology and machines, in fact, as you move up the autonomy spectrum and you look at the high end of the autonomy, then I think the autonomous system, certainly some of the research I've been doing, we perceive that as being more of a collaborative team member, but it's not necessarily something that will share experiences. It actually has to become a team member, and so that it performs as expected in those mission critical situations. And so that enables the human element to sort of build confidence and trust if it's behaving as expected, and also that enables you to maintain that trust that is built. So key aspects for that human machine relationship are more around the design features that machine has, and that it has, if you like, anthropometric morphism design features. So it does have kind of human-like characteristics, like a human maybe voice, might have accents, those sorts of things. So you can at least attribute some human characteristics to it. And it's also about actually functioning as expected and being able to see the inner workings of that machine. You need to understand how it's arriving at its logic and providing you with the answers. But I would say that once you do give that autonomous system the capability to enact some of those tasks, you then have to think, the thing that brings in, and it's always a difficult one, is about legal and ethical implications, especially where you're using lethal effects and there might be potential loss of life. It's who is then ultimately responsible when something goes wrong. Is it the commander? Is it the manufacturer? And I don't think anybody's really got quite an answer to that one yet, but it really is important to build the trust. Also, I think it was mentioned earlier that if you have a sort of failure mode situation, and you know, it might be a reversionary mode, you might get a loss, a degrading of the environment, or you get a cyber or a physical attack, and then you need to bring the operator back into the loop to intervene. And if they haven't been fully involved, then and kept their situation awareness, then that could be quite tricky at that point.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. Listening to you, I almost started being convinced that it might be easier to develop trust with a machine.
I think it would be, actually.
Precisely for, I guess, you know, Wilson's comment about Paleolithic emotions. I don't have to worry about, you know, those funny, fickle human emotions dealing with a machine. And it's a much more straightforward interaction, right, in some ways, which is also quite terrifying, because then the risk might not be too little trust, maybe too much trust in the machine.
Yes, I mean, I think that ultimately
I was going to say, Karen, about artificial intelligence and the bias that we're seeing in AI that fundamentally are being fed by humans. So although the technology isn't actually human, the information
the bias is still make it through. Yeah,
so I don't think we can say that future technologies will be emotionless. And you know, there's emotional sensing technologies, there's avatars now that respond in, you know, immersive technologies to your emotional states, and we're going to be measuring people's emotional states. So I can see that emotional technology coming along. And then there's another element which I thought was quite interesting when you mentioned about making them human-like. I did actually listen to a presentation which suggested the worst thing you can do is actually make a technology look like a human when it isn't. And I thought that was a really interesting point. Make it what it is. Don't make it what it should look like it could be, but it certainly won't behave in that way.
I don't think I meant look like a human in terms of face or body. It was have some of the human-like characteristics. We're not talking about making it look like a person.
But be quite clear that that team member is non-human, I think, was what it was suggesting. So
yeah, I don't think there would be any doubt that it was non-human, to be honest, not from some of the work I've been doing.
It's interesting.
Karen, I was just, one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking was what's the sort of latest research on how people view autonomous systems when perhaps there's been, certainly from the perception of the human in the loop, that there's been some sort of failure of trust. What's the sort of latest research suggest about what are the best approaches for recovering that trust when you're operating with those sorts of autonomous systems?
It's really around, as I said before, ensuring consistency of performance, consistency of outcome, in the inner workings, the logic of how the system is working, and that it builds the trust and maintains the trust. So those are the crucial elements. I mean, to be honest, there's hundreds of theories around about different elements of autonomous systems and trust. There's different layer models. There's the anthropomorphism one. The two I've run with are those two, but you could use others as theories as to how you build trust. But I think certainly in the military context, going forwards, maybe 10 years' time, there will be, those autonomous systems will be there incorporating, as Helen said, AI, machine learning. They will be utilised, and they will be utilised effectively for mission critical situations. So that trust will be there, and it will be part and parcel of how operations are conducted. I think there's another element that should be considered, and that brings me back to that sort of reversionary mode situation. To some extent, because they trust in the system and they rely on the systems and they can see them working effectively and in a lot of cases more effectively than the human component, then you might move on to a situation where you've actually got overtrust in the system. So actually overtrusting the system to carry out its duties. And then if it doesn't, or there's something goes wrong, the algorithms in the AI, the machine learning go corrupt, then the human isn't in a position to intervene and sort that out. And it could have lethal effects, in fact.
And I think the introduction of the civil autonomous environment and the introduction of automation on the flight deck, and this is research that we did many moons ago now, if you remember, but that basically showed that when you don't provide the person operating the system with the ability to understand what the technology is doing, when things go wrong, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. But as these autonomous systems become more complex and at the very high end with AI and machine learning, actually, and we've an example recently in some experimental work we've been doing with a decision-making aid, actually, for military operators. The operators absolutely thought it was fantastic. It provided brilliant answers, but what they were unable to do in any sense or form is work out how they got to the answers. They weren't able to understand it, but they still thought it was excellent. But the logic and how they got there, no, they didn't know. It wasn't clear.
Yeah. I can see this conversation can get us in some very interesting discussions. And you did mention the legitimacy issue and the ethical questions, which we barely touched upon. And we probably have to leave this for another webinar, but there's a huge, dimension there as well that we are certainly keen to explore further as part of the whole idea of, trust and human machine teaming. I want to bring our third dimension here, which is the institutional one, that medieval aspect that still defines what we do, particularly, if I may dare say so, within government defense, where we still have a fairly hierarchical way of being organized, and we do like to follow our rules, and rules have a role to play, of course. And I'll bring here our expert who brings also the operational experience, Alan, to comment on this. And, it occurred to me as we were putting together this report that it coincides with the 10th anniversary of the so-called Levine report, a report on UK defense reform which was chaired by Lord Levine. And for those who are not familiar with UK acquisition reform history, part of that report also introduced a concept called the whole force, which, while distinctly British, it does exist in other countries, if not as a term, certainly as a state of affairs, which essentially recognizes that defense is dependent on close collaboration between the regular military, the reservists, civil servants, and contractors, or if I may say so more broadly, the private sector. And there was a report that was recently released by the Serco Institute and the King's College, and it had an interesting conclusion. It said that if the potential of the whole force is to be realized, the defense industry relationship needs to evolve into a partnership model. The key to improving the relationship is the development of trust and incentives to work collaboratively. So, Alan, from your experience in defense training in particular, which is not an area that would naturally bring the private and the public sectors together, particularly when it is very close to operations, but also more generally, what are your thoughts about the importance of trust in the relationship between military and industry, and particularly in the delivery of training?
I think it's hugely important, and the reason being, I mean, even if I start sort of, at the genesis of, say, my sort of service, sort of back in the 70s and 80s, sort of flying in the 80s, I was taught to fly by a civilian contractor. And that's the way that it goes. Today, basic ab initio students are taught to fly by civilian contractors, and they do an excellent job of it. I think what has happened certainly in the last 20 years, and certainly moreover in the last 10 years, is there's been a slight, well, almost a seismic change, if you will, in so much as a lot of the sort of the more advanced operational training that was always the bailiwick of the military themselves and the reservists, to some lesser extent the civil service, but certainly not contractors. Some of those tasks are now being passed across to contractors, And so that for that to happen, one is happening out of necessity, but two, for it to happen and for the service personnel to have confidence that the training they're receiving is the best that it could be, probably better than they could deliver themselves with currency, recency, etc., then there has to be that trust between those parties, because this is something that's relatively new. So if we look at even from an Inspire perspective, whether it's advanced operational flying training on Apaches, to the point of weapon release, if it's the provision of operational mission data or pre-deployment collective training in the synthetic environment, we are now literally training people to go in harm's way, and we weren't doing that before. So that level of trust that we've just been spent the last half an hour talking about and waxing lyrical about sort of how it's made up and why it's important, this is now vitally important, because on the battlefield or in the operational theatre, trust itself, if you like, is the currency that soldiers, sailors and airmen use. From an interactive perspective, that's what leads them, or that's what allows them to go in harm's way. They know that people will have their back. They know that they'll be looked after. They'll know that they've got the best equipment that government could afford at the time. They know that they've received the best training they could possibly have, and they know that they could improvise, adapt and overcome. So it has become hugely important, and a lot of that the requirement to demonstrate, build and show trust has now passed over to industry.
Yeah.
Al, I thought they were really interesting comments, actually. I had an opportunity to read the Surf Institute report, and it's surprising, actually, how many times trust as a phrase sort of comes up in that report. And it's clear, certainly from at least some of the people who were interviewed, that there are parts of the industry that currently don't feel trusted, or feel that they're having their motivation questioned when seeking to be part of that sort of whole force sort of concept. What do you think that sort of MOD and sort of governments more widely can do to encourage and sort of build sort of more trusting relationships with industry partners?
It's a really, really interesting question. It's something that we are working on the whole time and trying to influence both the contracting services, the authorities, DNS, etc., and the customer to ask for certain additions to contractual arrangements. And what I mean by that is that we know, for instance, that certainly for going on operations, that you require the operators would require certain mission essential competencies, if you will. There are certain things that they need to do. So in order to build those mission essential competencies, that you're going to need some really, really good skills. You're going to need some great knowledge, but all of that can be garnered and gathered and built through exceptionally rich learning environments, through really, really rich experiences. And what we are trying to encourage, and I think the way that the whole force can be bolstered, certainly from a contractual perspective, is by allowing the contract to be flexible enough, both in terms of length and width, if you like, to be able to allow the contractor to develop solutions, deploy where required in training scenarios with their friends and colleagues in the military, so that you can jointly gather those experiences, so you can develop the one, from the contractor's perspective, or the person who's designing the training, a real rich understanding, a deep and tacit understanding of the learning environment that's required and the outcomes required, whilst at the same time, face to face, building that trust relationship between, if you like, the trainer and the trainee.
Yeah, very good points.
Just to remind everyone on the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We actually have some really good questions from Hashim Hassan, and I'm actually inclined to actually put all of them to the panel. They're quite thoughtful ones, and it would probably take us more than an hour to answer. But if, given I think we want to maximize the time that is left for interaction with our audience, I'll just go straight to the Q&A. And in the interest of time, I'll probably bundle the first two and then the other two So Hashim writes, from initial discussion, would the panel agree that trust, which arguably is key to performance, is also complex and difficult to define? Given this difficulty, does the panel believe that defense researchers and developers have been successful in building in trust into their systems? What efforts are necessary to cultivate trust in human-machine teams? And does the panel believe we are successful in a just enough trust approach? And let me give you one more while you're reflecting on this rich question. Really liked Al's comment on building a quote-unquote library of shared experiences, which I think also Karen mentioned about shared experiences as well. This seems to strongly correlate with what Christina has mentioned on sharing information. Does the panel think that this might form a particular challenge when understanding and building trust in human-machine teams, particularly given increased reliance on automation and, as has been alluded to earlier, accepting data-driven decisions as opposed to receiving data used to inform human-led decision-making? Opening up to anyone who is brave enough to react to any of the comments here.
Well, I'll certainly give it a go to start with, because people are going to launch into the scientific side of things after me, so I'll leave the most erudite till later. I think linking up what Raf was saying before about the sort of the leadership within all of this and how that becomes important is, of course, the leadership of any organization that's actually containing human beings that require trust, or indeed machines that require trust building in them, is that from the top comes the culture of the organization. And of course, you can, as everybody knows, you can have the just culture, you can have a no blame culture, or you can have a no chance culture. I would suggest that, of course, when it comes to the human interaction, when you go beyond that level of I have confidence in, rather to I have trust in, a lot of that, the background noise, is the culture that they live in. The human will react to that culture and knows the consequences of that particular culture, but the machine doesn't. Whilst there might be some form of conscious or unconscious bias programmed into a machine that Helen was speaking about, actually the machine doesn't care. It's doing what it was told. The machine is not going to be told off. It doesn't care about the outcome. It's doing what it was told. So I think from my perspective, as in sort of building that trust, certainly within the AI and machine learning environment, I could not personally foresee operationally a chance where a data-rich environment was providing enough evidence to a machine that was going to allow a decision to be made that had such consequences and potential terrible consequences, which could later build down to a breakup, trust, if you will, that wasn't going to be sanctioned by some form of human being.
I can just chip in there, if you like, with respect to how you build that trust into the systems as you progress forwards. As just reflected back, it's actually something which is quite interesting, is that QinetiQ have been involved with other major defence companies in the UK and multinational operations, looking at the command and control of uncrewed systems and the uncrewed systems themselves. Actually, over the last 5 years, I think the first one was Unmanned Warrior 16. And some of the assessments that we do during those exercises and demonstrations are to do with the level of autonomy and also the trust that people have in those systems and the situation awareness they develop. And it's amazing how that level of autonomy has progressed over the 5 years, and trust and SA has improved. So I just chip that in as an example of actual real multinational operations demonstrations. And it's building what they're doing really, and with the technology, they're just increasing the automation level. And one of the things that is interesting working with engineers is that all they want to do is design the human out of the system completely and not have any human machine teaming. They just want the autonomy all by itself, and that's their aspiration ultimately.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a really interesting point, sorry, that Karen makes, is that I was talking to somebody who had an autonomous land vehicle, and it was an interesting story because effectively the autonomous land vehicle takes itself to where it needs to be and drives itself over there. But the human doesn't know exactly where it is when it's on its way, because that wasn't thought about. And I think that's really significant, because if I'm going to trust a technology like I trust a human, then it needs to talk to me and tell me what it's up to. And if, you know, my human's driving and is telling me where he or she is going, then so my autonomous system does. Because what happens then if it takes a wrong turning or drives itself down into a ditch? I have no idea where it is, and I suddenly have to do an enormous amount of workload and situation awareness and planning, and take me away to try and figure out what's going on. So
yeah, that's interesting, Helen, because it actually, in the subsurface domain, whether you don't have communications, you send your autonomous systems off to do their work, and they interact with one another almost as a swarm of autonomous systems. So if one breaks down, the other one knows that and will step in and take over their area. And no humans.
It's going to be context, isn't it? It's always context.
Yeah.
Now, to complicate things, and I'm drawing here on a couple of other questions, is that even if you come up with ways to really create that interaction between a human and a machine, what is still difficult to envision is how you would tailor that interaction to the human. And I think there's two linked questions to some extent in my mind. One is that when you look at humans in terms of the demographics, age, gender, whatever it might be, their relationship with technology or their behaviors in any kind of context will be affected by that. But from a machine perspective, presumably it's all a human, right? So, and then adding to that another aspect, and that was quite an interesting question that probably will be worthwhile incorporating into the next phase of the work we're planning, which is, thinking in the military context, you have, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, also kind of a joint aspect, and they all come with their own culture and cultures into this. How are we thinking about how you develop trust, particularly when it has technology that takes into account those different cultures and the way they interact? We all know the force structures is quite different across the services, and it does reflect the way they operate and get deployed into missions. And the team dynamic is different, in a platoon versus a squadron to some extent in terms of, how the operation is conducted. Now, you add technology to this, you'd have to tailor essentially how autonomy gets integrated into those cultural distinctive aspects, if that makes sense. So I guess it's a broad question, but in some ways, how do we make autonomy and building trust in the systems that is tailorable, if you will, to both the human, the situation, potentially even the culture of an organization?
Can I take this, strip it all the way back to the fact that this is about usability and user design and human-centered design. So, it's a passion of mine, diversity and inclusion. And, for people that are interested, go and look at the Royal Academy of Engineering's diversity wheel. When you think of your users, make sure you've thought around that wheel. Because what we should be doing is expecting a technology to know the variety of requirements of humans. So as engineers, as psychologists, as operators, we should be taking responsibility to make sure that these systems that we're talking about are designed to be inclusive. And I think that's the responsibility that we need to take on. And for so long, things have been engineered and designed for a specific group of people, which I won't express, but I think we all know who we're talking about here. And I think the main thing is it's so much more of a rich diversity of potential users here. And that's what we need to do when we're designing a system. And that will provide access for everybody, particularly relevant in the data analytics, artificial intelligence, cognitive system sense as well. But even within physical systems, It's more than designing a system so that everyone can reach it and sit in it comfortably. It's also about designing a system so everyone can interact and understand it as well as they need to achieve their job. So
I was just going to follow what you said there, Helen, actually, because I was sort of thinking about the question and actually how complex it is when considering what technology can potentially do to address the challenges that come up through the issues of culture. But I think there are huge issues still to be addressed, putting the technology to one side, and we consider the way that different teams and organisations work, whether we're thinking across service, across sort of national boundaries, or even perhaps sort of more commonly in terms of the sorts of teams that we look to support, which is sort of cross organisation, and they'll bring their own organisational culture in terms of different ways of working, different sort of reporting approaches, different expectations with regards to how much they should support others, or how they anticipate that grouping should be led. So particularly where you have that that group that's put together very quickly in some sort of a hybrid structure, each of those organisations bringing their own cultural, organisational way of working, I don't think we can sort of automatically assume that they'll mesh together and seamlessly be able to work in an easy sort of collaborative fashion, and that trust will therefore just fall out. I think what we need to do is to better understand the differences, the different ways of working, those different organisational cultures, and we can start to think about what we can do to support better integration, and then we can translate those principles into sort of autonomous systems to then support those type of teams.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether, Karen, you want to comment here. I think it might be relevant to this conversation around the adaptable versus adaptive autonomy. Because, you know, when we talk about autonomy, means it can be a lot of different things, right? And we can engineer autonomy to adapt in different ways.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Yes, we have also looked at concepts of adaptive and adaptable autonomy. Sort of adaptive is where the machine will initiate the switch in autonomy, and adaptable is where the human initiates the switch in autonomy. And that might be to a number of different circumstances. It might be down to environment, like the weather environment, the complexity of the situation, the traffic density, the mission required, and you can actually switch different tasks from the human doing them to the machine doing them, depending on these different variables that come in. And interesting, and we've done some experimental studies looking at that, and they were, we did them in a number of different type of task concepts, 3 different task concepts to look at a variety across a military context. And actually, the human operators were very much in favour of these concepts of adaptable and adaptive autonomy, because in some situations they want the autonomy to do tasks because they're overloaded. In other situations, they want to be involved in doing the task to maintain their situation awareness. But actually, they favoured being in charge of the switch. They didn't much like it when the autonomy did the switching for them.
Right, and we might have to have both modes, if you will, active in any kind of application. But I'm conscious we are unfortunately quickly running out of time. But it's been certainly a fascinating discussion, and I do hope, you know, for the people who weren't able to have their questions posed or answered, you know, feel free to send us comments, feedback and criticism as you see appropriate by sending a note to tmr@QinetiQ.com.